I'd like to call the Citizens Advisory Committee to order with the observation that some of the most intractable traffic problems in the county are within a half-mile radius of this building. Unfortunately, I think it would take a lot of dynamite. So we will open with public comment. Have a Ralph Hoffman.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ralph Hoffman, Walnut Creek, a political satirist. I have 2 sentences to read you. Our brave soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines should have invaded the North Pole instead of Iraq, Afghanistan, after September 11th, 2001. Even children know that they would have saved Santa Claus from drowning caused by terrorists who have caused global warming that is melting the Arctic ice cap. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we proceed next to approval of the summary of actions from our February 25th meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And any opposed? And 2 abstentions. Okay. Ask everybody to check their entries on the attendance log. Okay, if there are no corrections, we'll move on to the meeting calendar, which shows our next meeting to be on April 22nd. And if people would then also check their entry on the roster of the Citizens Advisory Committee, and I will take advantage of this situation to welcome Patricia Bristow, representing Contra Costa County. And is Mr. Tove here? Okay. We will also at some point hopefully have a Mr. Anthony Tove, T-A-B, Tave, representing Pinot, joining us. For our new member, a couple of things. There is a sign-up sheet, and if you're parked underneath, there is a validation stamp for your parking. Okay. Our first major discussion item is a review of the City of Walnut Creek's calendar year 2012 and 2013 Growth Management Program Compliance Checklist. And I assume we have someone here from the City of Walnut Creek.
Good evening, members of the Citizen Advisory Committee. My name is Jeremy Locurco. I am Senior Transportation Planner for the city. It's great to be here this evening. I didn't have that much traffic to deal with, although I just came up Oak here, so I do empathize with those that had a little bit longer commute. I'm certainly here to answer any questions that you may have. I will say, as a point of the checklist, is that one of the things that I noticed this year when I was putting together the checklist is that the development activity seems to have a little bit of an uptick in the 2012-2013 years versus the prior checklist, which was pretty scarce. There wasn't a whole lot of activity going on throughout Walnut Creek, and certainly probably not throughout the county. This year, as you can see, as reflected in the checklist, we have a lot of projects that were approved during that 2-year cycle. We also have a lot of projects currently that are under construction in Walnut Creek, and that's most of those that you see are really from a backlog of projects that were approved before the recession, but the money ran out. And through developer entitlement extensions, we just kept extending the approvals until the money actually loosened up a little bit. And so if you drive down in Walnut Creek now, you see a lot of activity. But that being said, this year's checklist, I think, pretty much reflects all of the activity that we are required to report under Measure J compliance. We certainly can available to answer any questions you may have. I could almost guarantee that the next cycle will probably even have a greater number of projects. So I guess the good news for ABAG is that we're meeting our regional housing numbers by building all of these affordable and market rate homes throughout Walnut Creek, and hopefully we're creating additional jobs through the expansion of Broadway Plaza. Thank you.
Just want to ask about something that I've been reading about recently. That there's been some concern that there's been an overemphasis on residential development in Walnut Creek, and there's some folks who are concerned that that is kind of eliminating opportunities for further commercial growth.
Right.
And I just kind of like to get your spin on that in terms of what in terms of general plan compliance and the apparent exemptions that some developers are able to take advantage of for their residential projects. Just curious.
So in most of our commercial districts, and a lot of where you're kind of finding that activity, you're finding it in mostly the core area. You have areas in the Golden Triangle around the Walnut Creek BART station, areas in our traditional downtown, which is our older part of town. We have a lot of what is valuable property that was previously housed office and commercial be redeveloped as 100% residential. In some cases, 100% affordable. In other cases, and I'll give you a good example, right across the way here on Geary, on the other side of Main Street, behind the Chevron station, there's a 4-story, 100% affordable senior project that was actually zoned retail. And through the process of meeting our RENA numbers, one of the things that we did is we assumed that aside from all of the multifamily designated areas for developers to build, there were also an opportunity near transit for additional residential projects to be built. That was a good example of a 100% senior affordable project. We also have a lot of market rate projects. The BART Transit Village is another good example, another 400 units. Right down the street here on Civic and Oak by Ignacio, you have the Brio, which is another 300 apartment units. And so a lot of this development, I think, has received, I guess to begin, a lot of this was approved before the recession. As I said, a lot of it got built once the money kind of freed up a little bit. But I think a lot of the concern to the community was that we're losing a lot of valuable commercial and office property to residential developers. And residential as a land use doesn't typically pay its way. There's a larger drain and impact on city services when it comes to providing police and fire, utilities, things like that. It's just generally more expensive than, say, more of a tax generating business for commercial. And so there was a concern for that. And our city council actually considered a possible moratorium on new residential construction in commercially zoned areas. Through a lot of dialogue, they ultimately decided that was not in the city's best interest, and they decided that with all of the projects that have already been approved or either currently under construction, that really left very few areas that would potentially be affected by the moratorium. In other words, what you see under construction right now would be exempt from any kind of hold on the moratorium, and they just decided, with what we have left, it really wouldn't be that significant of an impact. The other thing too is that in trying to create a vibrant downtown where the residences support the businesses and they live and they're able to walk to work and they're able to walk to services, you really need to have kind of a mixed use. And so there was some concern, well, does that mean that you can't build any residential in a commercial project? What about a mixed use project where you have commercial on the ground floor and you have residential units above? And so all of this kind of took place and this dialogue happened. And I think ultimately the council made the decision that it was probably not in the city's best interest at this time to consider a moratorium. There's still a quite large number of commercial office zoned properties around that are slowly getting redeveloped. You have 24-hour fitness over on Main Street here, which built a new building. There's Chick-fil-A, and there's Broadway Plaza, and there's another great example of a huge infusion of commercial space. So to answer your question, kind of a long-winded question, is that, certainly it's a policy decision, and it would have some implications, but because most of our commercially zoned property happens to be around the BART station, if we excluded residential, we would be sending a very clear signal that transit-oriented development would not be possible in Walnut Creek at this time if we followed through with that. Sure.
In working on below market rate occupancies, are you focusing on entire projects like the senior affordable housing, or are you also have provisions for below market rate units within your other normally market rate projects?
That's a good question. We do both. Most recently, and as of last month, February, we approved two new projects on Riviera, 100% affordable, that are going to be developed by Resources for Community Development. I happen to be the project planner for that project. Those are going to be very low to low income units, 100% income restricted, rental units. We also have other projects that are in market rate, and the developer has been, in most cases, has the choice to either provide the units or to provide an in lieu fee. And the benefit, there's pros and cons to both approaches. The benefit to actually providing the unit, whether it's for sale or for rent, for something like that, is that we actually get the unit that then can turn around and be occupied by residents. The flip side is that many of these 100% affordable projects require some financial incentives or financial match from the city. And unless we have a robust fund that would help purchase land acquisition or maybe construction financing, it becomes very difficult for a lot of these affordable developers to come in. So we have it's a two-prong. We have both an affordable housing inclusionary fee that the developers are required to either pay for projects, or they can opt to provide the units. So we do have that for market rate as well.
I have a question. Does the public ever have any input on the design of those buildings and how they're set up?
They do. All of the projects, multifamily, are required to go through our design review process. And we ensure through all of these, and through that process, there are several public hearings that take place. Residents obviously become very concerned with the idea of what's considered affordable housing. There's a lot of perception about some negative aspects of affordable housing, but it's also a very much needed demographic of our community that needs to be met. And so part of our objective is that we want a good building. We want a project that's going to last the test of time. Most of these affordable projects that are built are restricted to 55 years. So we want to make sure that if you're going to build it, the building's still going to look good after 55 years. And I think a good example, as we look across the street, is that Villa Vasconcelos project. That was an example of a senior 100% affordable project where there were several public hearings for that. But they did a great job, and not only the design, but there's solar panels on the roof. There's bioswales within the parking lot area, so it's environmentally friendly. But that's an example of something that was a win-win. It's close to transit, it's close to shopping right across the street, and provided some much-needed affordable housing for our senior community. Yes.
I'm really new, okay.
Oh, that's okay.
I read here where you have 13 total extremely low income units. Could you explain what that is and where they are?
Where I can't, and unfortunately I don't have the specific statistics. I'm sorry? I don't have I don't have the full report here, the housing element. In terms of the extremely low affordability, looks like there were some on Trinity that were constructed. There were also Third Avenue and Habitat for Humanity that were recently constructed that were built during that period. And I think some of those were considered to be extremely low income.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question about one project that I've seen, and maybe you referred to it and I just don't recognize the street or anything, but it's the high-rise under construction now behind the DMV.
Okay.
I don't know
Arroyo?
what street that is. Is that Arroyo, or
Arroyo, that's correct.
is that also apartments or condos, or is it office?
Those are condos. They were originally entitled, when they went through the first time, as apartments. They were intended to be apartments. The developer, I guess, citing the hot condo market, or the increasingly hot condo market, decided to put a condo map on it to give them the flexibility to sell the units. There's not a lot of process that they have to go through. They just basically, once the unit has been entitled, whether it's for sale versus for rent, the city has very little control over that, over restricting the sell or the rent of those units. It does affect, however, on the inclusionary, the affordable component. We do have different requirements when they're for sale units versus for rent. State law prohibits us from designating certain for rent units, and so in most of our rental communities, we have a different requirement when it's for rent versus for sale.
I'll just say I really appreciate your commitment to really trying to build housing around the BART stations, because I'm coming from a community where there is just so much dissent and disagreement about how to create housing in the downtown area, especially around the BART station. Sometimes it's kind of embarrassing. So I'm really glad to see a community that is finding a way to make that happen, because I think that if we're ever going to really address the transportation woes that we're facing, getting people being able to live closer to public transit is a key part of the solution. So I applaud Walnut Creek's efforts.
That's great. Thank you.
Any further questions by members of the committee? I'll entertain a motion. I don't believe our Walnut Creek representative is here tonight.
I move that we approve.
I have a second to recommend approval of the Walnut Creek calendar year 2012-2013 checklist. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Any abstentions? Passes unanimously. Thank you very much for appearing. Oh, I'm sorry. I do have a request for public comment.
I would like Ralph Hoffman again, Walnut Creek political satirist. I would like to say Jeremy did an excellent job of giving you a concise presentation of this subject. If you would like a lengthier discussion, actually, this was discussed for, well over an hour at the Walnut Creek City Council meeting of St. Patrick's Day. I did happen to comment at that meeting that if anyone, particularly if anyone was drinking Irish whiskey, they should take public transit rather than drive drunk. Particularly, we have the free 4, 5, and 7 routes, bus routes that go to town. One out here on the 7. But that did have a lot of public comment in it, for and against a 45 day delay because of this issue, and in the end, it was voted to proceed without the 45-minute delay. But this will be further studied, and like as I said, you can get pro and con views from the public and the council if you watch Walnut Creek Television. It'll be rebroadcast again, I think, this coming weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and next Tuesday will be another meeting. But if you're in the viewing area of WCTV, you really get a good presentation. Thank you.
Okay. The only other agenda item we have is a report from Mr. Beck on the status of the 10 cooperative agreements and 4 consultant contracts for the PDA planning grants. And I do believe that this will be an item of great interest to the members of the committee.
Thank you, Chair. In September of, earlier, MTC, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, allocated about $2.745 million, actually exactly $2.745 million to Contra Costa to do planning studies for priority development areas within the county. And there are about 35 priority development areas in most of the jurisdictions in the county, except Danville, Brentwood, and Clayton. In September of 2014, the authority, after having a call for projects, approved allocating that funding to 10 different projects. We also approved a list of 5 consulting firms who would do the project. And it was a little bit of a different process in that the authority contracted first with 2 consultants to help manage the process, because there are going to be 10 projects. And we got an on-call list of consultant teams to do the work that we would contract with, that the work would be done for these different sponsors. And in September, we approved the list of sponsors and their projects and the list of consulting firms to do the work. And in the intervening several months, our consultants first worked with the sponsors to come up with a scope of work and decide which team they want to work with. Ultimately, 4 of the teams got contracts to work with the sponsors. And last Wednesday night, the authority approved the contracts with them, with the consulting firms and cooperative agreements with the 10 sponsors. And I'd like to describe a little bit of what these different studies will entail. The first one is in Oakley. It's the City of Oakley Downtown PDA Market Study. You have pretty detailed scopes of work for each of them, some of them quite detailed. But I'll try to shrink it down a little bit. If you want to read through them at your leisure, or if you have already read through them, you'll already know some of this information. The City of Oakley one, they have a downtown PDA that they want to look at what the market is for development in that PDA. There's also a tie-in with a potential what they hope is a potential new rail stop on this Amtrak line. There isn't one now, but they're hoping that there could be one in the future, and they're trying to tie the market study in with the looking at a new train station in downtown. The San Pablo Avenue Complete Streets project, that's a project that Contra Costa County will be doing. It's a bit of San Pablo Avenue that's from downtown Rodeo into Crockett, and it's really a design project to look at how to make that portion of San Pablo Avenue more bicycle and pedestrian friendly, especially bicycle friendly. The PDA market and fiscal analysis of Martinez. Martinez has a downtown specific plan, and the city wants to look at whether the assumptions of market demand for housing and commercial uses in downtown Martinez are still relevant and still reflect current conditions. So that's what their focus is for their PDA study. The Moraga Center Specific Plan Implementation Strategy, that's quite a mouthful. The town of Moraga, has a specific plan for downtown, which they call Moraga Center. But there were a number of things that are needed to implement that, and one of them is to provide more detail in their circulation element, especially on what the streetscapes should look like, how wide the sidewalks should be, what standards there should be, where the bicycle lanes are. The other part is to revise their zoning ordinance so that the policies that are in the specific plan will be carried out through the zoning that the town has adopted. The fifth study has the very somewhat odd name, SCS by Strengthening Public Health Plan. The name came from an earlier grant application that the city had provided, but the basic idea with this is that the city of San Pablo would like to make the city, I could use the word Mecca, but a center for healthcare in West Contra Costa. So they're looking especially at what the demand is for medical services in West County that could be housed in downtown San Pablo, what the availability of land is within that area, and also to develop some branding so that they can go, the city and the other business groups within the city can use this branding to try to interest doctors and medical labs and other related dentists and other related medical professionals to locate in the city.
I've got to ask.
I know giving doctors medical center.
Well, yeah, I'm just going to ask. I mean, if this was implemented or considered before the current crisis at Doctors Hospital, or whether this is in response to that crisis.
The city has apparently been thinking about this for about a year and a half, so there was an understanding that the Doctors Medical Center was facing some issues, and those issues have become increasingly stark over the last year and a half. But they did know that these issues were around, that there were problems. They'd already had cuts at the hospital, so it wasn't exactly in response to it, but it went along concurrent. The next one is in the city of Concord. It's also a follow-on to their recently adopted downtown specific plan. City adopted their specific plan, I think, late last year, and one of the proposals in that specific plan was to develop a kind of a green circle around downtown, and this would be part of the design for that. It's would be on Grant, Salvio, and Oak Streets, and they call it a street corridor plan, and it would involve a conceptual design for it, and it would interestingly involve also looking at parklets along those corridors. Parklets are basically where you take a parking space or two and you provide a little park there. If you've walked up Powell in downtown San Francisco, you note that there are little seating areas that have taken a couple of parking spaces, and this is downhill, well between the BART station and Union Square. And they would look at doing something like that in downtown Concord as well. The next one is an interesting study in Lafayette. It's the Downtown Congestion Study for Implementing Lafayette's PDA. One of the issues is actually will cover a couple of issues. The big issue that it's going to look at is how do you deal with traffic on Moraga Way? Is it Moraga Road? Excuse me, I always get them mixed up. Moraga Road and Mount Diablo, where you have a lot of traffic coming from the south, going into their downtown PDA, making a right turn, making a left turn, and how do you deal with that? And they're going to look at what's there now, what issues they face, and potential ways for overcoming it. And it's a fairly substantial study. It's $450,000. It will also include looking at ways of getting to nearby schools near the downtown, because you have a fair amount of traffic on a fairly narrow street, and how do you accommodate safe routes to school in the area. And they also will be looking at parking issues, which is another issue that they've been concerned about for quite a few years. The next one is the El Cerrito San Pablo Avenue PDA Implementation Plan. The city of El Cerrito has also just recently adopted a San Pablo Avenue specific plan, SPASP. SPASP. Almost a palindrome. Anyway, there are a couple of issues that the city has yet to deal with that came up. They knew about some of them beforehand, but in developing the specific plan, they realized they needed to do a few things additionally, and much of it focuses on utilities and providing the infrastructure to support the development that the specific plan envisions. Interestingly, the city has, I think their sewer system is provided by a private utility, which is extremely unusual. So that's one of the issues that they're going to have to deal with when they try to encourage the development of their downtown specific plan. The next one is the San Ramon Iron Horse Trail bike ped overcrossings, Bollinger Canyon and Crow Canyon Road environmental clearance. Quite a mouthful. The city has been working on getting new bike trail overcrossings on Iron Horse Trail on both Bollinger and Crow Canyon, and the town of Danville is also interested in a crossing at Sycamore. The city has a grant already from Measure J. It's a Program 12 Measure J CCTLC grant to do conceptual design and public outreach for the design. And they recently did some public outreach on various designs for the two overcrossings. They're looking for something that looks, I think the most favored, at least for the Bollinger Canyon overcrossing, was something like the crossing over here at Treat. It's cable stayed, so it wouldn't block views as much as a more solid kind of bridge. This grant would just be for environmental clearance, because that's one of the steps you have to do before you actually build something. So that's what this would be. And the final one is the largest one, and if Jeremy had stayed around, he could answer some questions for me about this one. It's the North Downtown Specific Plan in Walnut Creek. The city is getting close to adopting its West Downtown Specific Plan, which goes roughly from west of California in downtown, north from Newell, I think, Newell north to Ignacio Valley Road, basically to the BART station. This one would be from Civic north to about Parkside, on the east side of California and on the east side of Civic and Oak. So it's that area that has the car dealerships, it has the DMV in it, it has the new apartments on Oak at Civic and Ignacio Valley Road. And they're looking at how to develop that to provide some housing and redevelopment around near the BART station. So those are the 10. We're finalizing the contracts and the co-ops are being signed. I think the last one is the counties. It will be signed next Tuesday. So with that, we should be pretty close to getting them started. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
You really got my attention about the Amtrak station in Oakley. There were a lot of us who had discussed that and hoping to make that a place, a destination, so to speak, for tourism in the long term. And I was just wondering, since the Antioch station is so close, how would you work that out with Amtrak?
Well, this is an idea that the city has, and that would be an issue. Rail stations, rail operators tend to want, if light rail, if it basically goes from trolleys or streetcars to intercity rail systems. And at the one end, you can have a stop every 2 to 4 blocks if you're talking about a streetcar. But when you're talking like something like the San Joaquin line on Amtrak, they want to have 10, 20 miles between stations so that they're not turning into a milk run. So that will be an issue. It's turning it into an issue for Hercules as well, for the Capitol Corridor. They will have to convince Capitol Corridor to approve a rail station, even though there's design going on right now for it. And they would get some benefit, the rail line would get some benefit from the improvements that would be done at Hercules. So the study will have some benefits even if there is no rail station, because it will look at what the market demand is, so that the city can adjust its planning to better fit the market.
I'm trying to remember from last September, it was a little unusual to pre-qualify consultants. Was part of that because they had to meet federal requirements as well, or show an ability to meet federal requirements? I may be confusing it with something else.
It's not the most normal way to do it, but the reason we did it the way we did is that, and we thought that it would be easier, since the federal procurement process has its issues and it takes a fair amount of time to go through, that it would be easier if the authority contracted with consultants to do work instead of all 10 jurisdictions going out separately and going through the process each by themselves. It is not so unusual to have what's called an on-call list of consultants. And that's essentially what we have. This was a little more complicated because the projects are a little bigger than you normally use with on-call consultants, which you're usually looking at $10,000 to $25,000 worth of work rather than $100,000 to $650,000 worth of work, which is what we have here. So the process of the sponsors selecting the consultants was a little more involved. Like in Lafayette's case, there was the statement of qualifications that we looked at originally, but then two of the consultant teams submitted even more detailed statement of qualifications to the city of Lafayette, and they did interviews with the two teams and ultimately chose one of them. So it was a much more complicated process, but I think ultimately it will take less time for everyone.
Actually, I feel this is one of the examples where the authority tries to foresee possible problems and proactively prepare to meet them. Having covered authority meetings, since probably 2006, or I've been impressed with the quality of the work the authority does. And of course, the fact that it leverages the money that was originally voted with Measure C and renewed with Measure J sales tax into not only issuing bonds with a very high credit rating, but obtaining a large number of grants from the federal and state governments. I think we've probably been one of the more successful authorities in doing that. But it is this kind of attention to detail that is one of the reasons this authority functions as well as it does. If there are no very further questions, thank you very much, Brad.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
I don't know, I got in here, so does everybody have a chance to pick up the one-page report on the last authority board meeting? Actually, it was, I will not go over it in detail. It was a pretty light agenda that night. I mentioned a few of the more key things in the consent calendar. A lot of preparatory work for the big mainline projects is actually approved in the consent calendar. The authority has a lot of cooperative agreements with various entities. And the major discussion item, I think, as most of the members of the committee probably know, the authority is seriously contemplating putting on a measure in November of 2016 to not only extend the sales tax further, but to double it to 1 cent, because we have already committed all of the funds that Measure J will bring in to underway or completed projects. So a big part of this, the preparation for this, would be a preparation of an expenditure plan, and especially what I would call signature projects. As some of us have been around for a long time, we remember certain major projects were referenced in the Measure J balloting, things like the fourth bore of the Caldecott Tunnel, I believe the Highway 4 improvements. And the authority has done a really good job on carrying through on those promises. And now, among other things, it is engaged in looking at the what next. There'll probably be a slight increase in emphasis on transit and non-auto uses in conjunction with the wishes of the public. I'm quite sure one of the major signature projects would probably be work on the State Route 4 I-680 interchange, which is probably one of the last major nightmare interchanges left in the county. And I'm sure a few others are coming up. So this is the kind of thing that this transportation expenditure plan would address. Another element was that we had public speakers from Bike East Bay, Save Mount Diablo, and the Greenbelt Alliance, because this authority, from all the way back to Measure C, has considered groups like this to be stakeholders just as much as transit authorities or the driving public. And I think that's one of the reasons that these measures have passed with the requisite 2/3 majority, is it's been very carefully balanced in that respect. And of course, the only regular agenda item Mr. Beck has caught us up with I don't normally mention correspondence to the correspondence section of the authority's agenda, but there was a letter that the State Board of to the State Board of Equalization by several major entities in transportation and labor and business, including the Self-Help Connie's Coalition. And this was a concern of a reduction in the excise tax on gasoline. This is part of a very complex swap arrangement that was entered into a few years ago with the state legislature to, I forget the details, but it was a trade-off between excise and sales taxes. And this is, carrying out the letter of that agreement, but would also have the effect of reducing the funds available by $1.1 billion for transportation. So these organizations felt it was incumbent on them to express some real concern. I believe work is going on in the legislature to address state funding for transportation.
Is that $1.1 billion figure statewide, or is that just for Contra Costa County?
That's statewide. No, if it was just for Contra Costa County, we'd be screaming even louder. And then, of course, what often comes up now in several places in the executive director's comments is the work on repurposing, or one of the repurposings of the former Naval Weapons Station into a test bed for autonomous and connected vehicles. But also, again, the funding situation. Our Executive Director, Randy Iwasaki, made a presentation to the Assembly Transportation Committee regarding the lack of funding. I forget whether Assemblyman Frazier is the chair of that committee now. Yes, he is. He is advanced to chair. He is a former member of the authority board, so he's quite well versed and certainly a very effective advocate for transportation funding up there in Sacramento. So that's all I have, unless there are any questions. Yes?
Yeah, this where some of our members have elected to retire rather than to accede to that issue on the conflict of interest. Is there any further progress being made to getting rid of that piece of activity, that requirement?
The Form 700?
Yeah.
I talked to Assemblyman Frazier about that. His recommendation was that I write a letter to the FPPC outlining my concerns and seeing if they would rule on it. That was his first suggestion. I have been very swamped with other responsibilities, but I do plan to get to that at some point or other. I regard it as unfortunate, and I've made my views known to that I think Form 700 for members of this committee is a mistake. It is really an overreach. And if and when I can get to writing the letter to the FPPC, I'll organize my arguments in a more careful basis and certainly let you see them. Any further questions? Okay, well, I just need to ask if any has suggestions or requests for future agenda items. Hearing none, I have a motion from Richard to adjourn. Actually, I think I'll just declare us adjourned. And we'll see you hopefully Wednesday, April 22nd